Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
Exceptionally well. Thank you very much for asking, Rory. And we are delighted that you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 218. Wow. We're certainly getting through those podcasts, Rory. And today, 3 topics we're going to be looking at. We're going to start with our Counselling Foundations, where we're going to be asking the question, why did you decide to become a helper? What drew you into wanting to be in service of others? Then we go to focus on self, where we kind of recognize that you as the practitioner, you're the heartbeat of your practice. We need to look to self in order to be there for our clients. And today we speak about learning from our mistakes. We do make mistakes. What do we do when we make those mistakes? Do we take out a big stick and hit ourselves over the head? Or is there an opportunity to grow through that? And then in Practice Matters, which is our final topic for today, and Practice Matters is where we look at something that you might come across in practice. And today we have an expert that delivered a lecture for us in our Counsellor CPD library. And Rory, you spoke with Marion Elkin-Greener around the topic of addictions. So make sure you stick around for that, because even if you don't plan to work as a specialist addictions therapist, it may show itself. You may have a client who is struggling with drinking or some other compulsive behavior, and you'll get a lot of information from that last topic today on what you might do with that. But starting with those counselling foundations, Rory, the foundations that underpin good practice, for whether you're a student or a qualified practitioner, maybe you've been doing this for 25 plus years, we can always go back to this question. Why are you choosing? Why did you become a helper?
I think it's a really interesting question. It takes me back, Ken, to a sunny afternoon in September of 2002, if my memory serves me, when I was sat in my training circle on my first day on my diploma in counselling, and that question was asked, and each individual member of the group had to share with the rest of the group why they became helpers. And I have to say, it was one of the most incredible testimonies to why people put themselves in service of others. And there were some quite heart-rending stories about people who've been helped by therapy. I had a colleague who sadly lost a child, and she saw a therapist and she wanted to be able to help others who'd lost children. There were people who had difficult childhood histories. And there was me, and I said I've always had an interest in helping people, and I wanted to be a social worker when I left school. And in the misty past of the 1970s when I left school, I was suggested I became a bolt fitter's mate instead of a social worker by Mr. Brown, the careers master. I think he had a quota to fill at the local engineering company, and he was looking for bolt fitters rather than social workers. But it is interesting, and I think, Ken, it's a fundamental question we need to ask ourselves at the beginning of training and remind ourselves of as we go through the arc of our practice. Take us back to those fundamental position of what it is that puts us in the service of others.
Yeah, I think that you've just touched on, Rory, is super, super important. When we kind of look back and just go through the process of why did we become a helper, or why are you becoming a helper if you're a student on the journey? What it does is it kind of paints our why it is that we do this, and when you have a strong why, the how you do stuff kind of just falls into place itself. And the truth is, and we've spoken about this so many times on this podcast, and if you're a practitioner, you're going to know this as truth, and if you're a student, you're going to learn this as truth. It's not an easy road being there in service of others. It can be, you carry some heavy information at times. It can weigh you down. It can tire you out. We speak about burnout, which is the side of counselling where you're no longer able to be there for yourself, for your family, for others, and let alone your clients. And we watch out for that. Focus on self our next topic is all about kind of watching over ourselves. And, when the going gets tough, when it gets lonely, because it is a very, very lonely road. You can't share what your day's work was with your family when you get in. There's stuff you can't speak about because it's confidential, and you're carrying all of that. And when it gets hard and when it gets lonely, having a strong why is so important. Looking back and go, you know what, I do this for this reason is so, so important. And I think it's rare. I'm glad to be in your ears if you're listening to this. And I'm glad to be on your screen if you're watching this on YouTube. And for me, when I say I'm glad, it is an honor. And it's an honor because it's a certain kind of person that's going to listen to the Counselling Tutor Podcast or watch it on YouTube. It's a kind of person that stands, I guess, apart from what we consider to be the main flow of life, which is, I want more, what's in it for me? Seems to be the mantra of life. Acquire, acquire, acquire. More, me. And, if you're standing up and saying, I want to be in service of others, that is completely in contrast. Not me, them. I want to take my time. I want to study and I want to gain the skills to be there for another human being that might be in pain. And that is absolutely admirable. And I want to spend time with people like you listening to this, because you are my people. It's a special kind of person that becomes a helper. But look to your reason. Why did you do this? And I guess, Rory, if we start going into those whys, we can't kind of not look at old Kieran.
Oh yes,
yeah.
Well yes, yes, a little bit of Greek mythology, and of course, Chiron or Chiron, depending how you pronounce his name, was a centaur. That's a half man, half horse character, and he was wounded by an arrow that dripped in the blood of the Hydra, if I remember my Greek mythology correctly, and as a consequence, he suffered immense pain. But because he was immortal, he lived with the pain forever, and he spent his time looking for ways of reducing the pain. And I think, a lot of people who come into therapy, and you listening now might be one of those people who've been helped by others, and you want to help others. And I think it's a great position to start your counselling journey in. But I would say that you need to have your own stuff at least managed before you go in to becoming a counsellor. Counselling training isn't therapy. And I've had a lot of conversations through the years with students who quite clearly needed therapy because they were looking for some resolution to some real difficulty. And I think it's a question to ask yourself, am I in a position where I'm strong enough to be able to work with others' pain? We are, to kind of look at a bit more Greek mythology, we're therapeutic Spartans. We put ourselves in harm's way, at least emotional harm's way, every single time we step into the therapy room, because we don't know what's going to be brought up, what it might trigger within us. And I think, that there's a certain amount of emotional robustness that's needed. And also, I think the focus on what are my responsibilities. We hear a lot of talk about, I know my rights. What are my rights? My question is, what are your responsibilities? Because to become a counsellor, you need to be accountable and you have responsibilities to those you serve.
Yeah. It's that seed, isn't it? Your reason for doing this. It's the seed that needs to be planted in the soil of ethics and working to what the evidence prescribes, to theoretical models, to joining an ethical organization and working within a framework, having a managed activity where you're taking that you deal with to supervision. So there's a lot outside of the seed. But if we look back to the seed, what is your motivator? And Rory speaking about, I pronounce it Chiron, but Chiron sounds just as good. The wounded healer. So many of us choose to go into a helping path because we've been helped on our path. I speak about part of my life was in the absolute darkness, and somebody popped a hand into that darkness and said, come, and cared enough to be there for me at a time when I couldn't even be there for myself. And that made a significant impact on who I am as a human, who I was as a human being, who I am today as a human being. And it led to the road of wanting to help others. But there is a danger in that, as Rory has said, the road we traveled to get out of our darkness may not be the same road that a client travels to get out of their darkness, and today, the last session today, when we're going to Practice Matters, I'm going to be hearing about addictions, and I worked in addictions for many years because it affected my family quite profoundly in a number of ways. And one of the things I learned in addictions is, if you've been in addiction yourself and you're no longer in addiction, you're in recovery from that addiction, and you're working in a helping capacity with others that may be in addictions, very often you will not share your journey with them. And the reason for that is that was your journey, and you found your way out through the methods and the way that you found your way out, and they may find their way out a different way. So you don't want to contaminate their line. And the same is true as any kind of helping. If we've been through a process of going from hurt and pain to maybe a position of more freedom around that, there maybe is a temptation to kind of lead others down that same road, the road that we know works. But as you study counselling and as you look into it, you're going to learn that it's not about us. We go in with, our passion and the reason that brought us in there, but it's all about the client, and it's about them finding their way. And we are merely facilitators. But I guess if we gain anything from maybe going through our own stuff, it is maybe a more non-judgmental and a more empathic way of being, that we know that people can find themselves in dark places with very few choices, maybe through no fault of their own, or maybe even through choices that they may have made that were not the smartest choices at the time, because maybe we've been there too. It's an interesting topic, this. Why did you become a helper?
It is, and I think it's, if you're listening to this and you may be thinking of going into counselling training, you may be thinking, I might go to the local college or a training provider, and you think this could be for me, and you've stumbled across our podcast. Well, first of all, welcome. But what I would say is, have a think about your why. Ken has nailed it, really. Why do you want to do this? Because anybody who does counselling training will tell you it is mighty, mighty tough.
Yeah.
It's, I've had people who've done master's degrees and degrees on my course. They've said, this is far harder, and I'm doing what is effectively a level 4, the first year of an undergraduate degree. It's so much harder because it's not just learning the academic side of things and a few rules. It's about how you bring yourself to the party, if you like, how you bring your A game to working, and part of that is a self-reflection and self-evaluation and being absolutely honest with self. And that is hard work. That is where the growth and the development and the understanding of ourselves, it becomes so important, because once we start to understand ourselves, we can then be there for others. But if we don't know ourselves, then it becomes very, very difficult, because there's areas of darkness that we don't know. Could be prejudices, could be stereotypes, could be that we just shy away from certain topics because we don't like talking about them. And counsellors can't do that. We have to go where no one has gone before, to paraphrase a famous
Star Trekian therapy.
To go boldly, yes. So there we go. And I guess to some extent, to labour the metaphor of Star Trek, it is a mission. It's a journey, and through that journey into the unknown, to meet new people and new ideas, we develop, we learn, and when things get tough, we sit and we say to ourselves, why did I become a helper? And that's the well that refreshes us when things get tough. It's a place to go to quench our thirst and some of our frustrations, and remind ourselves the fundamental reasons that we started on this path.
Indeed. We have a handout for you. It is called The Skilled Helper by Egan. And you can get that just by going to our website, counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. It's at the top of our homepage. You're listening to a podcast right now. You're going to find this podcast. It's episode 218 right there on the page, the show notes describing what we discussed today, and a free download, The Skilled Helper by Egan, which kind of touches on the topic that we've just explored in our Counselling Foundations. We now move from those Counselling Foundations, and we recognize that you are the heart of your practice. We need to focus on self to be able to be there in service of others. And today we look at making mistakes, and is this something we can learn from making a mistake, Rory?
Well, I think the first thing we can learn from making mistakes is that we will make mistakes. I make mistakes. Only this week, I forgot to put my supervision date in the diary, and a very puzzled supervisor phoned me up and say, "Aren't we supposed to be having supervision today?" And I realised that I'd put it into. I've got a new diary I'm running, and I put it into the other one. So I apologised profusely, and I guess that is a mistake. And my supervisor, who I've known for some time, was okay with it. But my learning from that will be that I'm going to have to keep two complete diaries, one for my practice and one for my other day-to-day activities. And my day-to-day activities, which I look at all the time, is going to have everything in it. My idea was to keep two, and quite clearly I can't. And I think it speaks to two real areas of our practice, reflection and reflexivity. Reflection is where we reflect on, what we've done and, how we've been, and have a think about it. Reflexivity is what you're going to do about it. Mm-hmm. How are you going to fix it or be different next time? And I think there's a lot of focus on being reflective practice, but I'm a great believer, and certainly with my supervisees, in reflexive practice. Okay, we've reflected on it. Now what? Yeah.
And there's an element of ownership and responsibility around that, but there's also an element of empowerment. Looking at being reflective, maybe looking at what didn't go according to plan, doesn't fix anything. It just kind of shows you a potentially negative view on something. Now, we've spoken just a few podcast episodes back around kind of how we are with ourselves if we kind of make mistakes and get things wrong, that self-compassion. So there's one element of it, but is there learning from it? And often when you're speaking about things not working out as initially planned, we look to the work of the creation of the light bulb, and how there were hundreds, if not thousands, of attempts that did not work, and each one was a learning opportunity of what not to do the next time. And there is the reflexivity, what not to do the next time, or what you can put in place to avoid this happening again. I'll share something from my own practice. I was practicing from my home, and I was sat with a client. There was nobody else in the home. It was a dedicated room for where we would hold our practice, so we weren't to be disturbed. And then about halfway through our session, suddenly there was mad banging at my front door. And that mad banging was from a very disgruntled and frustrated post person who couldn't get the post parcel through the door and wanted to hand it to my hand and or get a signature for it, or I can't remember the exact thing. And I had to, the banging was so interruptive, I had to excuse myself and go down and deal with that and come back into my session. And that's not what you want in a session. That's not what anybody wants in a session. I could have left that beating myself up and saying, oh, that should never have happened. But I took it to supervision, and in supervision we thought around how can we make sure that never happens again. And the solution was an A4 piece of paper that says, meeting in progress, do not knock on the door, any parcels, put them in the green bin. And that was put into one of those little plastic file sleeves and stuck on the door with sellotape from the very next session. And guess what, Rory? Never another knock on the door.
There we go. And that's a classic example of some reflexivity, isn't it?
Yeah.
Getting stuff done. And I think that, sometimes, even when I chose the podcast title of this section, Learning from Our Mistakes, sometimes I think it's how we word it. Mistakes are learning opportunities. They're opportunities to review what we've done and say, how did that happen? What can I do better? You've outlined it beautifully with the post person and the sign on the door and fix it. And I think one of the big things that I always promote with supervisees is if you've made a mistake, own up to it. Just own up to it, because unless it's something that is steeped in malpractice or malice, usually mistakes can be fixed or acknowledged and in the time that I've been supervising, I met supervisees who've called their clients by the wrong name or booked two clients and they've turned up on the same time. And I've said, and ethical frameworks say this, sometimes just apologise. That's all you need to do, just an apology and say, I'm very sorry. And then say, this is what I'm going to do in future so it doesn't happen again. And I think that the biggest problem that some people get themselves into is a failure to acknowledge the mistake and B, apologise for it. Yep. And I was speaking to someone a long time ago who'd been sanctioned, and they were explaining what had happened, and it became clear that they had made a mistake. They didn't acknowledge the mistake. I heard a lot of, well, it wasn't my fault, and wouldn't apologise for it. And it became a bigger and bigger thing until eventually he had to sit in front of the ethical board, who basically said to them, you made a mistake and you didn't apologise for it. And now we're going to have to sanction you. So, if you have made a mistake and, you're in practice, just take it to your supervisor, try and make it, well with your client, apologise and review it at the next session. I'm very sorry this has happened and this is what I'm going to do, to stop that happening again. And I think most people are okay with that. I think what people aren't okay with is when people deny there's been a mistake and just dismiss and discount someone's experience of things not going well.
100%. We are human, and to err is human. It's part of how it is. It really is. When I listen to the word mistake, it's interesting. I imagine in my head somebody holding a pen out in their hand and me stretching my arm out to take the pen, and I grab in the wrong place. It's a mistake. I didn't take what was there. But the intention behind a mistake is I really did want to do the best. I wanted to grab the pen. I just missed it, and that's the thing. A mistake, when you kind of look at it, when you reflect on the mistake, you will see that your intention was pure. In my case, it was not my intention that a client's journey should be interrupted by a knock at the door. It's a mistake. We're not. We're there and we're accountable for it, but we're not responsible. We didn't make it happen. It happened from an error in judgment, or it could have just been something that played out that we had no control over. It wasn't malice or planned that way. So there is the reflection side, reflective. What can we do? What can we put in place here that this doesn't happen again? The reflexive side. And what's interesting is if you look at our last episode 217, the Counselling Tutor Podcast, we spoke about CPD and planning your CPD. Part of doing CPD or continuing professional development is engaging in whatever the subject matter is. Maybe it's listening to this podcast, maybe it's reading a magazine, maybe it's watching a lecture online, maybe it's going to live training. So that is the activity itself. But then post that activity, they were then called on to reflect. So what did I learn? What was that? What did I hear in that podcast? We're now reflecting. And then reflexive is, what am I going to implement from that? And we're called on, certainly by the BACP in the United Kingdom, that when we do CPD, it's not just saying, I did the CPD, here's the hours, let me tick this box. We're called on to say, reflect on that CPD and speak about what we might do differently because of that CPD, or maybe even not do differently. We might do some CPD and go, well, I know that's certainly not an area or topic for me, and that's learning in itself. And what I'm getting to here is that if you have a mistake within your practice, It's CPD. It's CPD. You get an opportunity to think about it, you get to reflect on that, and you get to think how you might change your practice going forward to minimize the chances of that happening again or to avoid it altogether. You are learning in service of your client. And you know what? I think that you should be able to put it on your CPD log and say that you spent 30 minutes making a sign for your door because you learnt the following from it. And I challenge the ethical body that will knock that back and say that's not learning in service of your clients.
Absolutely. And I think it's refreshing also to talk of mistakes. There seems to be a culture, doesn't there, certainly, shall we say, abroad at the moment, certainly in the UK, of people not admitting mistakes and denying mistakes and maybe not being honest about making a mistake. And all that happens is people get furious about it and say, why don't you own up to it? And I think there's nothing better than someone saying, I screwed up, I got it wrong. People are okay with that. What people aren't okay with is people just denying and denying and denying. And I think you're absolutely right, Ken. Maybe I will put on my CPD log if I get audited that one of my learnings is that it's certainly not a good idea to have two diaries that have different things in them because they just clash. I'm going to have to work a way out of having just one diary. But yes, it is interesting, and I think it's sometimes refreshing. I think it's refreshing when someone makes a mistake. I mean, I've had, my doctors phoned up and said, I made a bit of a mistake here, Roy. And it's like, someone's admitting to making a mistake. That is so refreshing because there's this culture of protecting your back and, I don't want people to see that I'm not perfect. And it takes the humanity out of an interaction, I think.
It does.
Yeah.
And it also brings incongruence in. Now, I think that we need to put in a disclaimer here, and that is that Rory and I are not giving advice, certainly not giving legal advice. We're talking about accountability here. So we're just discussing a topic. And when we're talking about mistakes, we're talking about kind of innocent things that may not go according to plan rather than practice complaints and things like that, which would be handled very, very differently. So we wanted to just kind of frame that. That's pretty important. And I want to end this topic firstly by inviting you to go to our Facebook group, which go on Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, come join tens of thousands of like-minded individuals, because that's the place where we have these kind of discussions and people share maybe mistakes they've made and what they've learned from it, and you can be part of that discussion. Facebook, just put in Counselling Tutor. And then just to kind of back out of this topic, recently television program made by the BBC, which I get to watch because I'm based in the United Kingdom. It's a little program, I think 4 programs, a little mini series called The Interceptor, and it's about a police officer who is going through some challenges and is seeing a counsellor for this, and at one stage the counsellor gets his name wrong, and it was really interesting to watch that play out and to watch what that effect was on him as the client in that relationship, and what the effect was on the counsellor who got that wrong, and how the counsellor immediately said, you know what, I've got your name wrong, and the reason I've got your name wrong is because I see people back to back and I haven't got my files in the right order, and I apologise profusely, and that won't happen again, and I'm now going to change my files. It was just interesting to watch that very topic that we're discussing play out.
And I'm sure there are lots of people watching that who could, clients who could identify with that, who may very well have had a very busy therapist use the wrong name or kind of mix them up with someone else.
We're just human. That's it. And this is our focus on self, where we recognize that we as the humans, we are the heartbeat of our practice. We now move on to practice matters. Interesting topic today, speaking about addictions. This is part 2 of a podcast from a lecture that was done by Marion Elkin-Greener in our Counsellor CPD library. Rory, you met up to discuss this in some detail.
Yes, we first met Marion Elkin-Greener in podcast 200, and if you want to go and see Mer's chapter 1, first discussion around working with addictions. If you go to counsellingtutor.com, click the podcast tab and look for podcast 200, you'll hear her first interview with me where she outlined the lecture and talked about working with addictions. But in chapter 2, we went for a bit of a deeper dive, and Marion really did outline what it is to be an addiction therapist, and more importantly, why addiction therapy is a very specialised field, needing very specialised training. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome back Marion Elkin-Greener, who's come on today to talk a little bit more on working in addiction therapy and what we have to be thoughtful about if we have a client who may present with addiction. So Mir, thank you for joining us again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I just love doing stuff like this.
So I guess the question that a lot of people might have in their minds is there a difference between generic counselling and counselling for addictions?
Well, there's a difference because there needs to be additional training in place to working with someone with an addiction issue. The core needs don't change in terms of the empathy and positive regard, etc. But as far as knowing, you have to do additional training to learn about the difference between addiction in terms of behavioural and process addiction, and drug and alcohol, and then also how to treat that, and also understanding what the substances do to the mind and the body. So yes, there is additional training.
Yes, it sounds to me like you've hit on some of those. We could just pick those up. The one that you've just mentioned, that having a knowledge of what different substances do is important. Why is it important?
Well, I think the best way to see is that it's important because if you look at something like alcohol addiction can, the way I try to explain it is alcohol addiction, if you try to stop drinking immediately, you can actually cause yourself some really grave physical harm as well as psychological, but you can actually have a seizure, a fit, as they say here in the UK. So you should never just quit drinking immediately, and you should always be under the care of your GP or a psychiatrist when you are wanting to reduce your alcohol intake. So I think that's a good example of where it's good to know what each substance, if it is a substance addiction, because there's behavioural addictions as well now that we know about,
yes,
that affect the same side of the brain. But I think it's good to know what each substance in that case can do to you. Coming off of heroin or opiates will not kill you. It'll be horrific. It'll be miserable. And it will, the symptoms, the side effects are awful. But alcohol, stopping that immediately could potentially kill you, because you could have a seizure. So it's those little things that you need to know when you're in the world of addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I worked in the world of addiction for a short time, and I think one of the things that you need to think about is using the correct language for drugs. There's a lot of street slang, and yes. I think that part of that as a practitioner isn't to talk about hashish, is to say it's cannabis, because in my experience, and I don't know if this is yours, what can happen is if people don't know what they're buying, they can buy all sorts of things and get it further into addiction. So, for instance, in my part of the world, brown is actually a slang term for heroin.
Yeah, and I've heard that. I absolutely see what you're saying, and I worked in a drug and a rehabilitation centre, Rory, for many years. As we would admit people, and they'd go through what we call a medical detox, they'd be monitored, and then they would stay with us for either 30 60, 90 days, sometimes even just 2 weeks. But it's almost like you have to learn this language, because even if you know what the right terms are, chances are you're maybe working with people who call it other things too. So it's really interesting. It's kind of like you especially, I worked with a lot of people who were involved in gangs and gang culture. And that's a fascinating area too, because there's a lot of addiction going on within the gang culture as well, and in some places in the United States where I worked. So yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It's very interesting.
It is,
and certainly there's a lot of research that's been developed with it too.
Yeah, and I heard you also say the word treat, and that is something we often hear in counselling and psychotherapy. You're going to be in treatment. There is a definite directive element, isn't there, when you're working in drugs and alcohol counselling?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. What I've learned I've been back now living in the United Kingdom for almost 7 years now, and the treatment for addiction is there isn't as widespread treatment, I think, or availability here in the UK as to what there is in the US. So obviously, rehab is a big deal over there. What they call partial group day groups is very big. So you maybe go for half a day to groups and then see an individual therapist. And the system over here is quite different. There's only, in my knowledge, here certainly in Scotland where I'm based, there's only 3 big rehab centres where you can actually go and stay in a drug and alcohol rehab. I know in the UK there's a lot more, but certainly in Scotland. So yeah, it seems a lot of the treatment appears to be community based up here in Scotland, and I'm not always convinced that that's good for the first 2 weeks to a month, if not more, for a person who's trying to stop using substances.
But I guess in terms of working, counselling someone in addiction, there is, and you're an addictions counsellor, there is this element of treatment, isn't there, and strategy, as opposed to maybe being non-directive, as we might see in person-centered therapy. It's a goal-driven process, isn't it?
Very goal-driven, and I get it. Sorry if I misunderstood you there, Rory. The research is showing, as far as family therapy is very useful in the addiction world for treatment, because it's very much seen as a family disorder. So the addiction doesn't just affect the person who has it, but it ripples out and affects all of the family. So family therapy can be very useful. Dialectical behavioral therapy has shown a lot of promise and can be very useful for emotional regulation, distress and intolerance, etc. So DBT is another good one, and then the big one, of course, in the UK, and one that's shown it works quite well with a lot of people, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So very systematic, very goal driven, agenda driven. What are we going to work on? What does that look like? And collaborating with the client at all times, and being very involved in the collaborative therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, and I think also in my experience, I'm not a drugs and alcohol counsellor, but certainly working in a satellite field, is that you have to budget for relapse from time to time. You may be working with someone, and then for whatever reason, they may have a blip, as it's sometimes referred to, or there may be a relapse. And I think that if you're working in that field, you've got to be very realistic, because it is very tough. Addiction is a very tough, it's a very tough job to be an addictions therapist, because you may not see positive outcomes all the time.
No, I would agree with you. And relapse is part of recovery. One of the things that is important for me to share with my clients that I work with in addiction is that relapse will be a part of your recovery process. There's very few people who do not relapse. And by the way, that's whether it's a a substance that's been used, or it's a process behavioral addiction that they have to, say, pornography or working out or shopping. It's not always just drugs and alcohol we're working with. So it's part of the recovery. It's good to set the client up to understand that, because there's already a lot of problems with shame and guilt, what happens is a lot of times a patient relapses, and then there's just this feeling of, I'm no good, I can't move forward, what's wrong with me? Whereas now in the world of addiction, it's just that is part of your recovery, is that relapse and how you deal with the relapse at that time and get back up on your feet again.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's so important for anybody, not just that therapists who are working in the world of addiction, but anybody who works in the world of addiction, is that, as you say, part of the recovery is relapse. And I think it's how workers, interface with that and support someone who's gone through a relapse that's really important, because I think, maybe historically, people may have just written people off. Well, you can't do it, and by having it as a built-in process, by saying, well, this will happen, just stick with it, we'll keep going again. I think that's mightily reassuring and very supportive.
Absolutely. And I think that, it's our job as the addictions therapist to educate and set the client up to understand, okay, so if I have a relapse, what are the where can I be signposted, or what are the what's out there for me to utilize to help me get back on track again?
Yeah.
And I think in the very early days of recovery, that's something that should be very clear to the client. There should be an education surrounding that, and also just who the support systems are to hold the client up if they do relapse, so it doesn't just continue into negativity, and there's a lot of accidental overdoses, etc., as a result of people just not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do next, and just feeling so ashamed. Whereas if they have a relapse plan in place, then they know what to do if they do relapse. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So it seems to me that part of an addiction counsellor's toolbox is, strategies, good solid referral pathways, partnerships, and being able to signpost, and
not feeling you have to do it on your own. And I say this even for people who are working in, I guess we can call it generic counselling, Rory. I think it's just the very idea that they understand that the clinician understands also that you're not the only treatment provider in the client's life. So that's fine if they come to see you once a week or once every couple of weeks, whatever it may be, but build up their support system outside of you. Collaborate with the client to work with, and this goes for generic or addictions counsellors. Build up the system surrounding the client, so they shouldn't just be relying on you as a treatment provider. It should be a number of signposted areas and what's out there for them. And that can be, it can be as simple as talking to them about the 12-step programs that are online right now with COVID. You can't do a lot of stuff face to face, or they're starting to do it more now. Or just even educating them on what websites are out there that are, appropriate for them to utilize for additional support.
Yeah. So psychoeducation, a very big part of the addiction counsellor's kind of portfolio. Yeah,
very much so. And just the whole idea of, I don't just treat addiction. I treat, it's well-rounded in a sense where, generally anyone I've worked with who's addiction issues has some sort of mental health issue that goes along with it. So it's dual treatment. It's there's usually comorbidities, as they call them. So I don't think in my career of 20 plus years that I've ever worked with someone who just has alcoholism or a diagnosis of alcoholism. There's generally depression or anxiety or both, or a mental health issue or a trauma, or do you know what I mean? There's something that comes along with it, so you have to be very well experienced and educated in working with dual diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've outlined, very eloquently what, the kind of role responsibilities of an addiction therapist is. I wonder, as we come to the end of this interview, Mir, what takeaways do you hope that people will be able to get from your lecture? What do you hope that people will take away after they've seen your lecture?
That even though it could be complicated, it can be very rewarding. It's a fascinating area of the field to work in. I have a particular soft spot for the family members of people who have addiction issues, just because they're so incredibly affected by it. So you do get to, in a lot of circumstances, work with families as well. Mm-hmm. So I enjoy that. So the kind of the broader treatment spectrum as well. But I think the big one for me is that to be careful with your judgment. And this goes across the board with counselling, but there's a tendency to judge a druggie or judge, oh, look at him, he's just an alkie, or her, she's just a druggie, whereas these are human beings who have been self-medicating for a long time as a result of something bigger in their life that they're trying to cope with. So it's not, if you're going to go into the addiction world, you really have to take stock of, like, not judging a person, and being very non-judgmental and having empathy, because I'll be honest with you, Rory, I think anybody can have an addiction. I don't think it's just, for a certain class of people or culture or society. We see it across the board, rich, poor, doesn't matter the color of your skin. So it's just, I think it's just having an open mind and just hopefully not being judgmental with people who have addiction issues.
Yeah. Be open-minded and be thoughtful, and maybe take the words of Terence, the philosopher, who said, "I am human. Nothing human is alien to me," which I think is an apt axiom for thinking about working with people with addiction. So It just goes for me to say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much to Marion Elkin-Greener, to you, Rory, for hosting that interview, for bringing that content to us. If you're interested in learning more about addictions and how they may present in your therapy room, you can go to counsellingtutor.com. We have got a CPD library, and you can join that. If you're already a member, just log in, put in a search for addictions, and you'll see all of the lectures on that. If you're not a member, all the details on how to join up at counsellingtutor.com. This has been episode 218 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, Rory.
It has, and we started off with Counselling Foundations, asking a very, very fundamental question. Why did you listening become a helper? And then we went to focus on self, and we talked about learning from our mistakes. We do make mistakes. How can we learn from them? How can we be reflexive? What are we going to do about it? And then finally, we had a fantastic interview. I had a fantastic interview with Marion Elkin-Greener, where she went into a deep dive around working with addictions and what addiction specialism really is. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.